Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. It's time to take some viewer questions, and we are going to start with Martin over on Patreon, who asks, um, it's he's noticed that I've said in the past that Canada's House of Commons would be better if we had more MPs. Is an increase in the number of MPs something that's been talked about among the Ottawa crowd? How realistic are the prospects that the number of MPs could be increased? Have the parties ever expressed positions on doing so, and would it raise any constitutional issues? A few different things to dig into there, but the first thing we need to realize is that adding MPs is always politically unpopular. Ontario, at one point in the early 90s, went through a process of getting rid of a number of their MPPs because, as the Premier put it at the time, it was the Fewer Politicians Act, and it was all populist noise disguised as budget cutting, and so that's always a popular thing. The last time that we went through the exercise of increasing the number of seats in the House of Commons, which we generally do every 10 years or so, the Liberals at the time decided that they were going to oppose it and try and figure that we could do with 308. We'll just shuffle a few around and we'll just, redraw some riding boundaries, but we'll stick at 308, which was not a really smart idea, but that's kind of the ethos that we get stuck in Canada when we talk about needing more MPs. More MPs would be good so that we have a more robust backbench, which is better for accountability. We'd have more bodies to put on committees, especially right now where there are not enough to fill all the committee seats. Meaning that there's going to be parliamentary secretaries on committees now, as well as other MPs doing double duty across committees. So that's not a good look for anyone, and it's not a good use of time. But there's also challenges every time we talk about increasing the number of MPs. Again, back to the last time we did this, the Conservative government at the time proposed a formula which basically was going to screw Ontario in terms of the number of new seats that they were entitled to. Adding more in Alberta, Saskatchewan, because they've had population growth, but Ontario, which has always had a great deal of population growth, they wanted to kind of cap the limit, and there was some pushback, and they eventually gave them about 10 more seats, but it's still not enough for what Ontario actually needs to have a more balanced level of population in the ridings. And then you get on top of that, there is this notion in Quebec that they deserve approximately 25% of the seats regardless of whether their population is growing enough or not. And so you get more push and pull dynamics around that as well. So it's a complex process. We have at least done a good job in Canada of depoliticizing the riding boundaries themselves with judicial commissions, so that we don't have the same gerrymandering problem they have in the US. However, it's not as easy as it sounds, and there's not the greatest amount of political will to do it, because the moment you propose it, you get people like the so-called Taxpayers Federation crying that, we already have too many politicians and it's just going to cost a bunch of money, and so on, as though, democracy is somehow better on the cheap, which it's not. So, yeah, those are some considerations. Constitutionally, the only real one is that seats are allocated in provincial way. So you can't just add. Some seats have floors in terms of how many they are entitled to as a minimum. But other than that, there's no kind of constitutional upper limit. Our next question is from Brendan over on Twitter, who asks, why were the Conservatives able to set the agenda / control the narrative in the last election without resort to criticism about the Liberal communications? I think this one is a bit subjective because I'm not sure that anyone necessarily controlled the narrative or set the agenda in this election. Particularly because certain newspapers certainly gave it their all to try and set the narrative and the agenda on their own, which didn't always work either. Part of what happens in an election is a lot of media outlets get very, very cautious about ensuring that they're being fair to all the parties, and then you get a number of the more marginal ones who are getting a lot more airtime than they are necessarily due or entitled to based on their position. However, they're kind of put up there among the other party leaders as though they are somehow, given a legitimate shot at forming government, even though you and I and everyone knows that's never going to happen. So I think that's part of the effect we're seeing is that, the attempt to try and be as fair as possible would give them some airtime that, we may have otherwise decided, something wasn't actually newsworthy, but because it was an election, we kind of gave it the benefit of the doubt and went for it anyway. The other thing I would say is I think events in this particular election kind of overtook any one particular party. Whether that was, the whole blackface, brownface thing, or to a certain extent, the different revelations that came out about Andrew Scheer's resume and so on. So again, looking back, I'm not sure that I necessarily saw any one party controlling the narrative. And certainly nobody was doing it effectively. We've seen previous elections where, you'd have parties come out with Conservatives in particular early on were very good at this. They'd come out first thing in the morning with a new policy proposal and they'd kind of set the agenda that way. That didn't really happen this time. They gave an attempt a couple of times, but a lot of those policies were basically bringing back previous Harper era ones, and it didn't really capture anyone's imagination or anything like that. So again, the attempt was there to set agendas or control narratives. I don't know that necessarily got as much traction in this particular election as in previous ones. And I think that's also why this last election seemed fairly listless in compared to others. We didn't have much of a narrative around it that kind of gelled, and it's not that there weren't particular big issues, because there were, but it was difficult to find something that gained a lot of traction, and there are myriad of reasons for that, but again, I'm not sure that anyone necessarily controlled an agenda or a narrative in this one, which I think kind of explains why it felt the way it did. Thanks for all your questions. That's it for this week. Join us again in the new year for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.